Hello, my name is Frank, and I am a recovered compulsive overeater, and I am presenting this workshop on preventing and recovering from relapse. This video was produced based on the materials presented at the online workshop. The opinions expressed in the workshop reflect the experience, strength, and hope of the workshop leader and do not represent Overeaters Anonymous as a whole. Additional notes from the workshop are available at bit.ly/OA Relapse Notes, where the letters OA and the N of notes are uppercase letters. All other letters are lowercase. Case is significant in bit.ly links. Here are the contents and timing of this video. The two major parts of the video are my story of recovery from relapse and the talk about preventing and recovering from relapse. I will start with my story of recovery from relapse. I'll first just give you my brief weight history. My top weight before I came into OA was 430 pounds. I actually walked in the door of OA in August of 1979, and I was around 380 pounds at that time. In my first year in the program, I lost 180 pounds, and I got down to my goal weight of 200 pounds. I spent about 8 years at that goal weight, and then I started a long 19-year alternating relapse recovery, and my weight went up and up and up a lot more during the relapses than it went down in the recovery periods. My top weight in the relapse periods there was 460 pounds. But I think I spent most of my time in the 350 to 400 pound range. So, if you can imagine going all the way up to 460, that's obviously in relapse. Then if I get down to 400 or 350 from 460, that's obviously in the recovery period. And I probably went up and down from 350 to 400 a half a dozen times in those 19 years. And it took me longer to go from 400 down to 350 than it took me to go from 350 back to 400. So overall, I think maybe half of that 19-year period was in relapse and half of it was in recovery. And since that period ended on June 25th, 2006, I am coming up on 14 years of abstinence on June 25th of this year. So I have 14 years now plus 8 years initially, and maybe 10 years of relapse during that 19-year period and 9 years of recovery. So I might have altogether something like 30 years of recovery and 10 years of relapse in my 40 years in this program. Unfortunately, that makes me an expert on relapse, and I hope it also makes me somewhat of an expert on recovery. And I'll try to share what happened to me so that you may be able to avoid that. So I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was the oldest of 10, but there were 11 live births. I had no idea that I had a problem with food until sometime in 7th grade. We were sitting at the dinner table with 6 of us kids plus my mom and dad. And as I was reaching for a second helping of mashed potatoes, my dad said something to me like, if you stayed at this weight as you grew taller, you'll be just fine. And I had no idea that I wasn't just fine right then. So that definitely stuck in my mind at that time, and that's why I can tell you about it today. I had more of an experience of being a fat kid in 8th grade because the boys in the 8th grade called me Hippo, and I hated that. Luckily, the name didn't go with me into high school. And I was probably in my low 200s in high school there. I don't know exactly what it was. So I was definitely an overweight high schooler. And in high school, I decided I wanted to become a physicist. So I went away to MIT. And in my freshman year at MIT, I probably gained about 50 pounds. The problem was the dormitory I lived in had unlimited seconds, and I sure didn't limit my seconds. I probably left MIT at something like 300 pounds. And while I was a senior, I got into both weed and alcohol very heavily. I was a late bloomer since I was an overweight nerd, not a partier. Then I came out to go to graduate school at Stanford, and I was drunk and stoned quite a bit at Stanford, and my weight went up and up, and that's where I got to 430 pounds, which was my top weight before the program. I was definitely not doing well at Stanford. I had to change my thesis topic from a very hard theoretical thesis topic to a much easier experimental thesis topic, and even so, I barely got my PhD. I think my thesis advisor let me get the PhD because I told him I would be working in Silicon Valley as a software engineer and not as a physicist. So my addictions cost me the career that I thought I wanted to have in my life, and that I had worked for about 10 years of undergrad and graduate school. So how do you get to 430 and to 460 pounds as top weights? It's by quantity eating. You know, as a physicist, I knew the law of conservation of energy, and therefore I tended to avoid the very high calorie foods because I could eat a larger quantity of food if I ate the slightly lower quantity foods. So I was kind of a meat and potatoes binger. I didn't really go for the sugar and fat because I wouldn't be able to eat as much. For example, in graduate school, one of my roommates taught me this recipe for lasagna, which I really liked. So I would make a tray of lasagna, which was going to last for 4 meals. I was going to cut it into quarters and do a quarter at each meal. That whole tray would be gone that night. I would go back to get a second helping, and then a third and a fourth, and that was it. You know, other than that, nobody really saw me eat. I would do all my eating at fast food on the way to or from one thing or another, you know, and I could stop at McDonald's and get 5 McDonald's sausage biscuit with eggs. Now, if I was really trying to be virtuous, I might cut it down to 3. But of course, 1 would be more than enough for breakfast. And you know, my quantity eating even continued into my recovery. In my first period of recovery there, where I was counting calories for my food plan, I discovered that cantaloupe, a whole cantaloupe, could only be maybe 150 or maybe 200 calories, depending on how big it was. So I would have 1 whole cantaloupe a day, and sometimes I'd have 2 cantaloupes in one day. You know, I had an allowance of 1,500 calories, so it was only 10 or 20% of my calorie intake, and it was delicious, and I really liked it. I kept that up until somebody noticed that my skin was turning orange. I finally figured out I was eating too much cantaloupe, so I had to cut way back on that. So after I left graduate school, I got a job as a software engineer working in Silicon Valley. And to get that job, I decided I should try to lose some weight, so I got down from about my 430 top weight to 380 pounds to go out and find a job. I was working as an engineer for about 3 years when I became really close friends with the secretary at our work. You know, she was a secretary to a whole group of engineers. And we would get together and smoke weed and watch TV and stuff. And then for a while, a brief period, maybe a month or two, we became more than friends. But then she wanted to end that, and that's what got me to come into the program. So in August of '79, I called the Palo Alto Medical Foundation to find out if they had anything about weight loss. They said that a therapist had been in to talk to them recently, and they gave me his number. So I called him, and he said that he would take me on as a client, but that I'd have to go to Overeaters Anonymous meetings simultaneously. Now, thank God we didn't have the internet at that time, so I had to look up Overeaters Anonymous in the phone book. I called the local number. I found out that there was a meeting very nearby on a Wednesday at noon on the Stanford campus. And so I went to my first meeting. Now, when I got to that meeting, that's when I discovered that it was a spiritual program. And it was a very small meeting. There were only like 3 of us. or maybe me plus 3 other people at the meeting. And so they let me cross-talk, and I asked, how can an atheist work this program? And they tried to convince me that I didn't have to believe in a conventional higher power. I could use the group as the higher power. And somebody at that meeting loaned me the AA Big Book and said, why don't you read this chapter, We Agnostics? That might be helpful to you. So I took that book home and I read that chapter, and then I was convinced that OA was not for me. The only message I got from that chapter was, if you stick with us, we will convert you. But I had to return that book, so I had to go back to that same meeting the next week, and I had another dose of pain in the week between those two meetings. So I was a little more willing to believe them when I said I didn't need to believe in a traditional higher power. I ended up going to the third OA meeting on the same day I went to the second meeting. I went to a much bigger meeting down in San Jose. There were maybe 30 people at that meeting. And that's where I got the hope that I needed, because this man stood up, and he was a thin man. Not, just slightly overweight man. He was a thin man. And he had talked about having lost over 100 pounds and how he had kept it off for years in the program. So I plunged into the program, and as a physicist, my food plan was to count calories. I was to aim for 1,500 calories a day. And I think in that first year, I never exceeded 1,500 calories knowingly. My best calculation was that I was 1,500 or below it. I started out saying I would have 1 beer with dinner. So I'd have to buy a 6-pack, and I have just 1 beer with dinner. I have enough beers for 6 days then. But it was never just 1 beer for dinner. I'd always have the second, and then the third, and the 6-pack would be gone. Then I had to buy another 6-pack the next day and have 1 beer for dinner. So after a couple of weeks of that, I finally realized I got to go to AA. So I went to my first AA meeting, and I haven't had a beer since then, or any kind of alcohol since then. However, I went on to the marijuana maintenance program for about 6 months. I was going to both OA meetings and AA meetings while I was stoned on weed. And weed didn't cause me to overeat. I didn't get the munchies anymore. I'd been using it chronically for about 10 years. My drinking and drugging career lasted about 10 years. So at about 6 months into the program, I had to go into surgery for a tumor. It turned out it was benign. But a week before surgery, I decided that if I coughed a lot after surgery, that wouldn't be good for my recovery. So I decided I would stop smoking marijuana a week before surgery. Then I said, 6 days would be enough. 5 days would be enough. So my last joint was the night before surgery. Now, once I was in the hospital for the surgery and found out it was a benign tumor, they actually kept you in the hospital for 3 days. So when I left the hospital, I had 3 days clean and sober, and I've kept it up ever since then. So my clean and sober date is February 1st, 1980. So I've just had over 40 years of being clean and sober. Now, somewhere along there, I did get a food sponsor, and that's who I was working with my calorie counting. And I would write down all the food I ate and count the calories accurately. And then at some point, a man volunteered to be my step sponsor, and I didn't ask him at all. It turned out he had been cut out of the same kind of mold that I was cut out of. He had been an atheist before the program. He had lost over 100 pounds. He had kept it off. He had both the alcohol and food addiction. I had avoided getting a step sponsor because the steps had that word God in them, and I didn't want to deal with that issue. I was really treating OA like a food and calories club. The first thing he got me to do was to give up the debate. As a physicist, I had my little proof that God didn't exist because there was no God in any of the equations that we studied in physics. And once I gave up the debate, then he got me to act as if, and to pray, even though I didn't think there was any higher power to pray to. I would say the serenity prayer, and most often what I got when I said the serenity prayer was some serenity. because I was almost always trying to change the things I couldn't change. Other people, places, and things. So I was noticing that was working, and that was the beginning of my act as if a higher power. And then eventually I changed it over to the meetings, and then eventually I changed it over to what I call the higher self. And the higher self has been the higher power that I've had for most of these 40 years, probably 35 of these 40 years, as my higher power. And if you look at our literature for both AA and OA, a lot of our literature talks about how if you ask God for help, if you just quiet your mind and listen for that intuitive voice, that intuitive voice that you hear could be God's answer to your prayer for help. So basically I turned intuition into my higher power. The main thing I need to know is that the Frank that's sitting here talking to you right now, this is the Frank who is selfish and self-centered. Frank is the addict. Frank is the problem. And there's a higher self within me which knows how to live life well, which knows how to accept the things I cannot change, and has the courage to change the things I can. And that if Frank would turn his will and his life over to the care of that higher self, his life will go much better. If I could rewrite any step of the program, I would rewrite step 2. Because physicists don't come to believe anything. The way that they accept a new theory is by gathering evidence. So if I could, I would rewrite step 2 to say, gathered evidence that a higher power can restore me to sanity. And that's what I've done for these past 40 years. I continue to gather evidence. Every time I turn my will and my life over to the care of that higher power, and it helps, that's more and more evidence that I can be restored to sanity. So for my first 8 years in the program, I got down to my goal weight within 1 year, and I was very popular. I was asked to speak at a lot of meetings. I was the keynote speaker at the Region 2 convention when it was in San Jose. I was the chairperson intergroup. I was the World Service Business Conference delegate. I knew the members of the Board of Trustees of Overeaters Anonymous personally. I was in hot tubs with them. And, I was active in Region 2 also. And my ego was growing bigger and bigger and bigger. Then my first sponsor moved away to the East Coast, and I got another sponsor. And then that second sponsor moved down to LA. So I was in between sponsors at the time. And I went to this buffet. Now at that time I had stopped rigorously counting the calories, and my rule at buffets was I could have 1 plate at a buffet. Now, it could be close to avalanching off the side of the plate, but as long as it fit on 1 plate, that would be an abstinent meal. And the hope was that it would be mostly salad, maybe a little bit of the higher calorie foods, but mostly salad. So I went to this buffet by myself one time, and I had a second and then a third plate. Now, these were much, much smaller plates, but 3 does not equal 1. However, I didn't have a sponsor that I could share that with. I couldn't tell anybody else in the program about it because all of my service positions had an abstinence requirement. And the World Service Business Conference was coming up in a couple of months, and I really wanted to go to it. So I kept quiet. Then I had another binge, and then another binge. And finally I had to admit I was beginning to gain some weight, and I had to admit that I was no longer abstinent. I gave up all my service positions. And that was the beginning of the 19 years of alternating relapse and recovery, getting up to 460 at my top weight. At that top weight, I actually considered bariatric surgery. I went in for a group appointment with the surgeon where he would tell us about the surgery and answer questions. And when I heard the surgeon say that they consider it successful if 50% of their patients can lose 50% of their excess weight, I thought that was a terrible statistic. Because I had experienced in OA that you could lose all of your excess weight. You wouldn't have to settle for going from morbidly obese to just being a fat man. So I didn't take the surgery. Now, during this time of alternating relapse and recovery, I stopped going to conventions and retreats. I used to go to the World Service Business Conference almost every year for, I think, 6 years. And I went to the World Service conventions every year. I went to the Region 2 conventions. Our intergroup had 2 retreats a year at that time. I went to both of those retreats. And then I was lucky enough to be able to retire young in the year 2001. And my goal in retirement was to get my recovery back in this program. Now, during all this whole time here, whenever I tried to count calories, it just didn't work. I wasn't willing to do it, and so I failed. I gave up on that. I tried other kind of schemes, and nothing was really working consistently. So I finally started my abstinence on June 25th of 2006. So I had 6 more years during retirement where I was still struggling with this program. What was different on June 25th, 2006 is that was on a Monday. And I decided on that weekend before that Monday that I was going to go to the Region 2 convention that year. It was going to be in Oakland, so it was nearby. And I decided it would be a good idea to have some abstinence before I went to the convention. So I started on the Monday before the convention. That's, the usual date to start any kind of a diet. And I went to a meeting a day that week. I went to 5 meetings before I got to the convention. And at that point, my weight was 400 pounds on that Monday, June 25th. And what I found was that calorie counting worked again. It wasn't the calorie counting was the problem. It was Frank that was the problem. So I went to the convention, and there I saw a whole bunch of my friends that I had stopped seeing when I stopped going out to retreats and conventions, and it was good to see them. I heard a lot of recovery at the convention, and I was doing so well I decided to go to 90 meetings in 90 days, and that worked so well that I kept up a meeting a day for about 3 years. And gradually I decreased it to 5 meetings a week, 4, 3. Now I have 2 to 3 meetings a week, and actually I get more meetings a week now that we're on Zoom. But when I used to do in-person meetings, it was between 2 and 3 meetings a week. So on June 25th of this year, I will have 14 years of recovery, God willing. And in August of this year, I'll have 41 years in OA, with 40 years clean and sober. Now, the thing about being a compulsive overeater is I'm convinced that my major problem is selfishness and self-centeredness. And that's what it says on page 62 of the big book. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our trouble. And the thing is, they're both addictions, and I need God's help with both of those. So like I said, my abstinence is at this time was from quantity eating. And I'm really lucky in OA because the only red light item I have is alcohol. So, all the other kinds of foods, I can actually have them. I can eat them if I choose to. But again, since I really try to eat more quantities and less, I tend to eat the lower calorie foods. Not all salads, but, I don't go for the big, huge dessert items. However, there are some foods that I have when I'm out or when I buy a 1-portion serving, but I don't keep them in the house where they might be calling to me. So I guess those would be yellow light foods. Anyway, for the last 5 years, I've got a new definition of abstinence that I use, and I borrowed this from somebody else. This is not original with me. So what I do now is I abstain from 4 things. I abstain from starting over, I abstain from perfectionism, I abstain from negativity, and I abstain from leaving OA. Now, the starting over is what would happen typically before. When I broke my abstinence and had too much to eat, I would say, okay, I'll start over tomorrow. That is actually a signal for me to eat as much as I can today. Because tomorrow I'm going to be abstinent again. So, get all that food in there that I can. Just shove it all in. Of course, the problem was, when tomorrow comes, I might still start over the day after that. So who knows how long I'm going to be doing this start over dance. And, I can put on weeks, months, I can put on 100 pounds starting over every single day. So now if I have too much to eat at one meal, I start over on the next meal. I don't make it into an excuse to binge, and who knows when I'll stop. Now, abstaining from perfectionism ties in with that. If I have a little bit of too much to eat at one meal, that doesn't mean that I have to start over. It just means I have an imperfect abstinence. So I only claimed 14 years of imperfect abstinence. There were definitely meals in those 14 years where I wished I hadn't eaten as much as I did. But it's not like I sat down and binged until, I couldn't put anything more in me. I would just have more than I expected. I'd have a second helping of something, or I'd add one extra things to the meal of what I hadn't planned on before I started. So that's the perfectionism. I abstain from trying to be perfect. Abstaining from negativity is probably, one of my big character defects of complaining about things, complaining about other people, complaining about politics, complaining about traffic, complaining about the weather. You name it, I can complain about it. So that's probably one of these 4 items here that I do the least well at. I still can be quite negative at times. But my goal is to be less negative, abstain from negativity. Then my final goal is to abstain from leaving OA. Even if I gain back up to 400 pounds, I am not leaving OA. I will stay in here to the bitter end because I know that this is where the recovery is. It's not out there anywhere else doing anything else. Now, because I have 14 years of imperfect abstinence, gradually over the years, I managed to put on some weight. I got down to my goal weight here in my last 14 years. My goal is 210 instead of 200 when I was 30 years old. Now at 60 and 70 years old, I'm allowing 210 to be my goal weight. I gradually creeped up to around 230. Now on the way up to 240. I was 30 pounds overweight. Now on the way up to 240, I would occasionally notice, hey, I'm up, I better go back down and lose some weight. So I would tighten up my food a little bit, and I'd go down a little bit, and then it'd plateau, and then it might go up again. So it was a very gradual process because it was just eating a little bit too many calories at several meals a week. So finally, 2 years ago, I decided I needed to do something different. And the first thing I decided to do was to just mentally in my head work steps 1, 2, and 3 before I start to have a meal, and see if I can get God's help to have less food at that meal. So the long version of that would be to actually say the full text of step 1, 2, and 3 in my head. The short version of that would be to say, powerless help. Powerless is the first step. I'm powerless over food, and I need your help to have an abstinent meal here. And that worked. I started to lose some weight just doing that powerless help or the first 3 steps in my head. But then that kind of plateaued for a while. So then I got an agreement with one of my sponsees that I would text the numbers 1, 2, 3 to him before each meal. So now besides doing the mental 1, 2, 3, I have to actually pull my phone out, get to my sponsee that I'm going to text to, type in 1, 2, 3, hit send, and put my phone away, and then I could have the meal. So it slowed it down a little bit, it allowed the 1, 2, 3 to stick a little bit longer, and I lost some more weight doing that for a while. But then even that kind of plateaued. So what I've done for about the past, 6 or 9 months, something like that, is I've done a much longer version of the 1, 2, 3 before each meal. So now I pick up my phone and I dictate a text message to my sponsee. And I try to vary it every time I do it so it doesn't become a rote prayer that I just say the same every single day. So that requires me to think about it a little bit. And I dictate it, and then I have to go in and correct any incorrect translations of text to speech. And I have to capitalize all my higher powers, because that's the religion I was born up in. You got to put that in higher uppercase. And I'll give you an example of kind of one of the longer ones that I might send on this 1, 2, 3. So it could go something like this. Dearest, beloved higher power, I am totally powerless over food and over my addiction to self. I have a plan for breakfast, so please help me stick to that plan. I gathered evidence that you can also help me with my selfishness and self-centeredness. So please help me to be loving, kind, patient, forgiving, and helpful to everyone I interact with today. Help me to practice those spiritual virtues in both my thoughts and in my actions. More God, less Frank is my motto. Dearest beloved higher power, thank you for all your help. So after I finish dictating that, I have to go back in and capitalize all the dearest beloved higher powers. I have to correct any translations. I have to put in punctuation if Google hasn't gotten that correct. And then once I've proofread it, I then hit send. And then I can put my phone away and have my meal. So this has helped a lot. I've actually gotten down to my goal weight. I'm actually below 210 pounds right this minute. And it's by doing this kind of a practice. And for me, actually, COVID-19 has been helpful because I don't eat in restaurants as much as I used to before. I guess restaurant meals tended to be bigger than my at-home meals. So that's one of the few benefits of COVID-19 for me. I know other people struggle more with COVID-19. So that has been working very well, and I intend to keep that up. I don't see any reason to change that. And you know, the thing is, over all the years, I never did pray very much. I was not a big prayer. I mean, I did get into meditation quite a bit about, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago when I took a meditation class, and then I took another meditation class, and there were times when I was meditating an hour a day or more sometimes, and I had a long stretch of a meditation every day. I've kind of fallen off of that. I now meditate only a few times a week, if that. But I hardly ever had any prayer practice. The only prayers I would say would typically be when I was at a meeting where we'd say the Serenity Prayer, or originally it was the Lord's Prayer at the end of the meeting, and now it's, all the other prayers that we do. So this is now getting me to pray 3 times a day, 4 times a day if I'm having a snack. I do the same kind of a thing for a snack. Now sometimes it's a lot shorter than that. If I'm really short on time, it could be I could be if I'm not in a private place where I can do the dictation, I might just type 1, 2, 3 snack or 1, 2, 3 dinner, and that's all I do because I can do that silently, and it won't take me forever to type it in by hand. But I make it the long version as much as I can. And the other thing is, if I forget and I actually start eating the snack before I remember to do it, I do it as soon as I remember. So it could be right in the middle of the meal, it could be right during the snack. I get my phone out and text the 1, 2, 3 to my sponsor. And if I forget entirely and it's hours later, I send a text at that point. I say, forgot, 1, 2, 3 at 1 o'clock for lunch. So that's what I've been doing for about the past 2 years. Now, something new in just the past 2 weeks that I've been doing, which has been very helpful, is to do the 10th and 11th step prayer as many times per day as I can. Now, both the 10th and 11th step prayer has a longer version, but the short version of them is that the 10th step prayer is Thy will, not mine, be done. The short version of the 11th step prayer is Thy will be done. So they're basically the same prayer. And the instructions for both the 10th step and 11th step is to say that prayer as often as I can throughout the day. In most of my 40 years in this program, I probably never had that thought come to mind and said that prayer even once in a day. I mean, maybe a few times over the years. I can't keep track of it, but 99% of the days would go through with never thinking of that prayer during the day. So what I've done for the last 2 weeks is I put a notification, I put an event in my calendar, my Google Calendar, repeating every night at 11:30 p.m. And the title of that event is Thy will, not mine, be done. And then I put 6 notifications on that. That's the limit. I wish I could put more than 6 in, but I put 6 notifications, 3 hours apart, going back to 15 hours before 11:30 at night. So the first notification I get is 7:30 in the morning. If I'm asleep, I won't notice until I wake up. If I'm awake, I get it at 7:30. Thy will, not mine, be done. And every time I see that, I can just say that mentally in my head. It doesn't take a lot of time. And the thing is that if I see the notification and I say it in my head, I don't swipe the notification away right away. The next time I open the phone, I might see the notification again. So I do it again. And even if I do swipe it away, another one will come 3 hours later. So I've been doing about 6 or maybe 10, step 10 and step 11 prayers each day in the last 2 weeks. I like this practice. I'm going to keep it up. So I'm going to conclude by talking about some of my favorite sayings in OA. I've got a whole collection of them. In fact, in the PDF notes for this workshop, I have a much longer collection, but here are kind of my top ones that I really like. The first one I'll start with is my favorite, which is the saying is that forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. Now, if I'm resentful at somebody or some institution, it's because they did something in the past that I didn't like. They did something I didn't want them to do. And I think that by holding on to my resentment, I can make up for that somehow. I can somehow erase that and make them stop doing what they did in the past. Even though they've already stopped, perhaps, I'm still going to hold on to that resentment for what they did do in the past. When I finally can get that I cannot change the past at all, there is no way to make any change in the past, that's, if I can accept that fully and completely, that's when I can forgive them, because there's no way that I can make any difference at all in that, and there's no way they can make any difference at all in that. And that's where I can get forgiveness. So forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. Another one is, I'm addicted to being right, but being right just means that I agree with myself. I love being right. I love pointing out to other people that I'm right. I try not to rub in the fact that they're wrong, but I love being right. And I have to really just go down a peg on that. All it means is that I agree with myself. It doesn't mean anything else at all in the world. Another one I like is that thinking is not a tool of the program. Read the 9 tools. Thinking is not listed there. Thinking isn't helpful in this program. Thinking is what gets me into trouble. So thinking is not a tool of the program. Now, speaking of tools, I tend to use weapons, not tools. And that's just the way it is. Finally, or not finally, but another one I like is I can't outsmart the disease. It's using the same brain I am using. The disease is right there in my brain. That's called Frank, the one that's talking to you right now. That's the person that has the compulsion, that compulsive overeater. And I can't outsmart Frank because Frank is using my brain to think. There's no way I can do that. Another one I like is that an addict alone in his head is in a bad neighborhood. That's a bad neighborhood up there where I'm thinking thoughts. Those are not useful things. As you can see, my favorite sayings all have to do with thinking, because I'm convinced that thinking is the problem. It's not the solution. And, I've got a PhD in thinking. That's what physics is all about. But, notice my PhD didn't help with this disease at all. This program is what helped with this disease. And finally, I'll end with my favorite saying, which is from Mark Twain. It's not a program saying, but it really applies to me. He said at one point, I've been through a lot of things in my life. Some of them have actually happened. And thank you for listening to my story. I'm Frank. I'm a recovered compulsive overeater. Okay, so now we only got 5 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions in the Ask a Basket? Oh, I'm sure. It made me miserable. I couldn't enjoy life at 460 pounds. I was having all kinds of health problems, diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea. I had to have a sleep apnea machine. Luckily, when I lost the weight, I don't have to use the sleep apnea machine anymore. I don't have to take any diabetic medication. So everything health-wise, I'm much healthier. I hopefully will live a lot longer now. It interfered with my personal relationships. Whether or not it actually did, in my head it did. I couldn't become friends with people. I couldn't ask women to date me when I was heavyweight, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's an awful way to live. Well, I actually, the term I use for myself right now is I'm a spiritual atheist, even now today, after 40 years in the program. I'm a spiritual atheist. I'm spiritual because I'm working in a spiritual program. I have a higher self, a higher power, higher self. I use the word God as just the nickname. That's the nickname for my higher self, because the higher self is the part of my brain that is giving me the ability to live life well. And so I adopt the name. Some people that name grates them. Luckily, I can live with just the name God. I just don't think of something way up here that created the universe and that is coming down to intervene in my head here from up there. It's all part of the part of me that's not the part that's talking to you. This part that's talking to you, that's the addict part. And that's the part that needs the help of the higher self. Kind of like the subconscious is the higher self, something like that. Like I said, I've got an elaborate theory about that. If anybody wants to hear about my theory, they can write to me. But that's not part of the program, so I don't want to talk about it too much further here. But write to me. I'll let you know. So I'm a spiritual atheist. Yeah, and that will be in the notes I send out too. But I abstain from starting over, from perfectionism, from negativity, and from leaving OA. Well, like I mentioned in the talk, it's the getting sick and tired of being sick and tired, of doing the same thing over and over again and getting different results, and not getting different results, getting the same results over and over again. So just kind of get worn down by this disease, basically, and finally got to the point where I just had to give up and really plunge into the program. The key decision, I think, was to go to a meeting a day. That was the 5 meetings a day there before the convention, the actual convention, and then 90 meetings in 90 days after that. I hadn't done a meeting a day during those, I was retired for, 6 years? I could have done a meeting a day for all 6 years there, but I didn't do that. I would go to my 2 or 3 meetings a week, and that was it. So really plunging into the program, I think, is what turned it around. So first of all, how often do I weigh myself? Well, you see, when I was weighing my food to count my calories, the weight would go down. And now that I'm not weighing the food anymore, I'm not trying to be very rigorous about the counting the calories. What I do is I weigh myself every day. And the thing is, I have to take the physics experimental point of view here, which is that this is a random variable. It's going to go up and down 2-3 pounds. I have a range of 2-4 pounds I can go up and down in. It doesn't mean I'm terrible if I'm at the top of that range. It doesn't mean I've been a great success if I'm at the bottom of that range. It depends on how many times I went to the bathroom, basically, is what it depends on. So, I assume that there's a signal with noise. So it's the long-term trend is what I'm interested in. Is the long-term trend down, stable, or up? Those are the 3 long-term trends that I'm looking for. But I do it by gathering a lot of data and then, with my eye, fitting a curve to it and seeing if it's going up or down. So that was the first question. What was the second question? Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I had. I would have 6 months of recovery, 6 months of relapse. Whatever it took me to go from 400 to 350, that's how much recovery I would have. And then I'd go back from 350 to 400, which usually happened faster. Going down was slow, going up was fast. So, I probably hit that 350 to 400 a half a dozen times at least between those periods. So that's why I think I have totally maybe about 30 years of recovery in this program and about 10 years of relapse, but unfortunately it was mixed over a 20-year period. So, yeah, it's a tricky thing, because, if the imperfection becomes too imperfect for too long, then I'm lying to myself about it. So if it really was a one-time slip, and it didn't happen again the next meal or, a lot the next week or so, that might be okay. And like I said, I'm lucky in that I don't have the red light food issues that a lot of people in the program have. And I'll be getting more into this in the other part of the talk here. So I think I'll try to answer that in the rest of the talk that I'm going to give. Now we're getting to the methods for preventing and recovering from relapse. So first I want to talk about addiction a little bit. And, addiction, in the doctor's opinion, it says the doctor said that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. So that's from the doctor's opinion, and that's the allergy of the body. Now, when I first heard allergy of the body, that's ridiculous. I don't have hives, I don't sneeze and cough because I overeat. But the word allergy just means any abnormal reaction. And the abnormal reaction that the alcoholics and the compulsive overeaters have is that once they start to drink or eat, they can't stop. That's the allergy of the body, the abnormal reaction, and it's called craving. Now, the other thing that we have, though, is an obsession, a thinking obsession in our thoughts. And in the second edition of the foreword of the Big Book, it talks about 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend. And so it's the obsession of the mind that causes the problem. So it's the allergy of the body that causes the cravings. The cravings come after that first bite or drink. And the cravings is the allergy of the body once we've activated the craving by the obsession of the mind. And it's the obsession of the mind is the part that gets in trouble. and I'll talk more about that in a minute here. But in the big book, there's a lot of other phrases for this obsession of the mind. It's also called the peculiar mental twist. By the way, all the page numbers I'm referencing here are all from the AA Big Book, 4th edition. So the peculiar mental twist, the insanely trivial excuse, an insane idea, the strange mental blank spot, the queer mental condition, and the mental twist. Now, it's the obsession of the mind is the cunning and baffling and powerful thing. This is the thing that can get you to take that first bite. Even though you know rationally in your head that if you take that first bite, you're never going to be able to stop. But this will convince you that, oh, you're not really a compulsive overeater. You know, you can handle it just for one meal. It'll be okay. Whatever it's going to do, it's cunning and baffling and powerful, and it'll get you to try to take that first bite. Once you take the first bite, that's when the allergy of the body comes in and the craving comes in, and you can't stop yourself from the second, third, and fourth bite. So the obsession of the mind, and my favorite example of that obsession of the mind is in the big book, is about the foolish idea that he could take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk on page 37. You know, this guy might be a compulsive overeater too, because he had gone into this tavern, he had a sandwich and a milk, then he ordered a second sandwich and a second milk, and that's the point that he decided, on this full stomach here, you know, one little shot in the milk mixed in with the milk, that's not going to cause any problems. That was the obsession of the mind kicking in with a cunning, baffling, powerful idea that once he had that alcohol in his body, he couldn't stop, and that's when the craving caused by the allergy of the body took over. So, in step one, we admitted we were powerless over food. This is basically admitting that we have that allergy of the body. And you have to take this to the core of your being. You have to agree that you are a compulsive overeater all the way down to the bottom there. And it's no question about it. It's not an if, and, or but. I am addicted to food. I do have that allergy of the body. Once I start to eat, I can't stop. Now, the second part of the first step is that our lives become unmanageable. Now, this is not a universal interpretation, but my interpretation of this is that this is admitting that we are powerless over our selfishness and self-centeredness. Because I'm convinced that my selfishness and self-centeredness results in all of my character defects, and that's what makes my life unmanageable, my character defects. You know, when I yell at store clerks or when I get angry with my wife, that's what's causing unmanageability in my life. I'm the cause of all that unmanageability by my reactions to people. So that's admitting I'm powerless over that too. So I'm convinced that step one, if we didn't have the obsession of the mind, step one would be all that we would need. And because we do have the obsession of the mind, we need steps 2 through 12 to deal with that obsession of the mind. And the way to deal with it is by giving you the spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, as it says in the 12 steps. The only result of working the 12 steps is you get a spiritual awakening. And it's a spiritual awakening which allows you to tamp down that obsession of the mind to the point where you can manage it. You know, if the obsession of the mind is full-blown, that's what's happening in relapse. The obsession of the mind is full-blown, and then gets me to even think I don't have an issue with compulsive overeating, and that's why I can go ahead and eat. So there are 2 ways to prevent or recover from relapse. The one way is to work the steps, and this is, I think, the most important way. And in fact, it's the way to prevent the relapse is to be in the steps all the time. And if you work the 12 steps, you can be in steps 10, 11, and 12. I'm going to talk a lot about those later, but 10, 11, and 12 is how you can prevent the relapse from happening if you're still in recovery. That's what you need, so you need 10, 11, and 12. If you are in relapse, the way to get recovery from relapse is to work the steps. And like I said, the most important one is that first step. If you can get that first step down and then start working the rest of the steps, and at the same time use the tools. So the 2 ways of getting this recovery is by working the steps and using tools. And of course, this is the list of tools that we use here. And by the way, the action plan is a great tool to be added here because the action plan can encompass anything. So any tool that you're going to use to try to keep you abstinent while you work the steps. That's what I really view the tools as. It's a way to keep your abstinence going while you're working the steps so you get this spiritual awakening, and that's what's going to give you the long-term recovery. Now, so to convince you, perhaps, that all you need is step one to get some abstinence, I'm going to tell a little bit about Bill's story that I got from a couple different sources. Now, Bill's story in AA is that his first hospitalization for alcoholism was in autumn of 1933. His second hospitalization was in the summer of 34. And in the big book on page 7 at the bottom, the doctor is talking to Lois and is telling Lois that if Bill drinks again, he will either go to the insane asylum or he will die. And Bill happens to overhear that, and he talks about his reaction to that on the top of page 8 on the second paragraph. He says, "No words can tell the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksands stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit." So he took step one right there in the hospital. Before he met Ebby, before he knew anything about spiritual recovery, he took step one when he heard the doctor tell his wife that he was going to either die or go insane. And fear sobered him up a little bit. A fear of step one of being afraid of taking that first bite or that first drink can sober you up for a bit. That's what gives you the respite to then work the rest of the steps to get the recovery that you need. Unfortunately, Bill didn't have the rest of the steps at that time. But several months later, he did drink again on Armistice Day of 1934. That's why he had about 3 or 4 months of recovery there between the hospitalization and Armistice Day. And that's when he was drinking again was when Ebby showed up. And on page 9, Ebby shows up with the solution, which is the Oxford Group plan. So Bill, here's Ebby talk about this plan, and he's not sure, it's kind of half-cocked, but he keeps thinking about it over the time there. And then finally he notices that he's starting to get some of the symptoms of delirium tremens from his drinking since Armistice Day. So he checks himself into the hospital, to Dr. Towns' hospital. And in fact, the story I read was that he borrowed from a grocery store owner, a small store, 4 beers. He had 1 beer going down into the subway on the way to the hospital, 1 beer in the subway, 1 beer on the way out of the subway, and then 1 beer in front of the doctor at the hospital. That was his last drink. So he goes into the hospital and he starts to sober up a bit, and then his friend Ebby visits him again. And this time, Bill's willing to listen to him when he talks about this program. And they actually work the steps right there in the room there in the hospital. Now, I'm sure he still had to go out and make some 9-step amends at that point, but he basically got his spiritual awakening in the hospital. And on page 14, second paragraph, Bill talks about his experience of God, and he has a longer description of it on the AA Comes of Age on page 63, where Bill talks about his white light experience of God. So step 1 can get you abstinence, then use the tools and work the steps to help get the 12th step, where you can have that permanent abstinence. So let's dig into the ways that we're going to do this. First of all, relapse is not an event. It's a process. Once you've taken that first bite, there were some things that led up to that first bite that you may have noticed or maybe you didn't notice, but it was a process that was underway for a while there that led up to that first bite. Now, if it's a process, you can intervene earlier. So a big part of the prevention of relapse is to notice that you're starting on that process of heading towards a relapse, and then intervene earlier. And the one way to do that is to try to notice the early symptoms, early relapse symptoms. Now I'm going to talk about a lot of them later in my talk here. But the other thing I forgot to add as a preface here is that almost everything I'm telling you here is what I've heard from other people. When I actually gave a workshop on recovery from relapse in Petaluma a year and a half ago, and I did a lot of research for that by going to the LA birthday party and listening to all the talks I could that were relevant to relapse, recovery from relapse. And at meetings where I've shared, I would make the topic recovery from relapse and get ideas and write them down. So this is all an amalgamation of all the ideas I've gotten from other people. Almost none of this is original to me. But in fact, just last weekend I was doing research because I went to a Zoom relapse recovery event put on by the Northern Virginia Intergroup. And this is the list of early symptoms that they came up with. And this is a much longer and more comprehensive list than anything I've developed. So I think this is a useful thing here. And it's going to be in the handouts, and you won't be able to read it now, especially if you're on your cell phone. You won't be able to read it, but you'll get the link to this before we start doing the other parts of the workshop here. But so look for these. And by the way, you don't read across in this column here. It's vertical column. So the first column here is all the things that are related to OA program, and then all the things related to physical and food, emotional, spiritual, and life events and triggers. So you notice those kinds of symptoms that might be occurring, that might be leading you to this relapse. The other phrase I heard from the LA birthday party is someone talked about the seemingly unimportant decisions. They called them the SUDs. The seemingly unimportant decisions or actions happen. The SUDs are the same as the obsession of the mind and the peculiar mental twist, or the strange blank spots, or the queer mental condition. And these are all the cunning and baffling and powerful parts that get us to overturn our first step decision that we are a compulsive overeater. And someone gave the example of their relapse started after just having some extra salad. Some extra green salad, that's not going to hurt. But that was the early symptom that they were on the path to relapse, and they did, in fact, relapse. Someone else said that when a new sponsor said, you don't need to call in your food anymore, they thought, great. And they agreed, but that led to a relapse because calling in their food was a valuable part of their program. So those were sudden, seemingly unimportant decisions that led to relapse. Other people talk about a diminished contact with God. If you used to pray and meditate a lot, and now you're not praying and meditating much anymore, or if you're not going to as many meetings, or thoughts came back that had left, for example, such as thinking about food as entertainment, or thinking about having abstinence as being hard. It's hard to do this. And if emotions are more volatile, that might be another symptom of you're on the way to the relapse. And then for me, it was the ego getting bigger and bigger there in my first 8 years in the program. I was Mr. OA, I thought. So, that's what led to my relapse. So, why do we eat? We eat because we're a compulsive overeater, and because we made up some kind of a story to justify binging. And that's the cunning, baffling, powerful obsession of the mind. Now, one suggestion I heard from somebody was to make 3 columns on a piece of paper and write, what am I giving to God in the first column? What am I not willing to give to God? What am I not giving to God? Why am I not willing to give it to God? And what would God have me be? That was one suggestion I collected at a meeting. Or about relapse, don't. And this is, I think, a useful thing. Consider changing relapse to abstinence interrupted. And even better, just a bad day in recovery. So this kind of fits in with my no starting over and imperfect abstinence. If instead of saying, oh, I'm in relapse, that's the same as saying, oh, I might as well keep going because I can't stop. Whereas if you say it was abstinence interrupted, or just a bad day in recovery, you can start the next day or the next meal is the most important thing. And these are helpful because going back to day one can lead to postponing day one for months, years, or even hundreds of pounds. In other words, counting days can be dangerous. Use with caution. Someone once said that slips were never just slips. They were always completely plotted and planned out. They knew ahead of time they were going to go get this, their favorite food, and where they were going to do it and how they were going to do it. Another suggestion is keep a healthy fear of food. Identify dangerous food items. And it's not healthy to say we were bad or good. That doesn't help. To think of or talk about cheating on a diet, to have an all or nothing thinking, or to think of OA as just a support group. It's not just a support group. It's a spiritual program. And then some suggestions for short prayers like thank you or help me. It doesn't have to be a long prayer. Or instead of praying for abstinence, thank God for the gift of abstinence. Now, the other thing I would recommend is reading relapse and recovery literature from OA.org. The notes I'm going to give you are going to correctly say page 16, but the slides incorrectly say page 12. So it's on page 16, and notes I give you are the list of OA relapse recovery literature that I think is useful. The Welcome Back pamphlet was redone in the year 2019, and that's particularly helpful, I think, the Welcome Back pamphlet. Now I'm going to talk about abstinence versus food plans. And you know, the difference is this. In AA, everybody's on the same drinking plan, 0. That's what makes it easy, in a sense, because it's on 0. But in OA, we have a harder problem because we have to eat to live. So we have to take the tiger out of the cage 3 times a day and then put it back in the cage. So the question is, what can a food plan include? Well, it includes what we eat or we don't eat, and that would be like the red, yellow, and green light foods. And these are my guesses of the prevalence in OA, but I would say the most common red light food items are dessert and sugar items. Maybe 90% of people have that as a red light item, followed by flour products, maybe 50%. And then for some people, it's the salty, crunchy foods. Maybe 20% of the people have that. Then the next thing is how many times a day do we eat? Do we have 3 meals a day, 3 meals plus a snack? Some people need to have 5 small meals for medical reasons. Or do you eat when you're physically hungry? Or is there no eating after dinner? So all these times per day is another issue. What times do we eat our meals? How long do you have to have between meals? Can I have breakfast, lunch, and dinner all before noon? Or is that going to be a problem? And how much do we eat? Do we weigh and measure our food? Do we count calories? Do we just moderate meal? And then there are food behaviors. For example, no fast food or no watching TV while snacking, no second helpings or only eating at a table, or no eating out of the refrigerator or pantry, or no binging and no bulimia, or guilt-free eating. So food behaviors that go into that. And then do we commit our food plan to our sponsor at the beginning of the day every morning? And how exact does that commitment have to be? And how are changes of the food plan for the day handled? And then how perfect do you have to be? Can you have imperfect abstinence? For example, when I counted calories the first and the second time, I would have a goal such as 1,500 or 1,800 calories, but then I'd have an upper limit of 3,000. So if I went over my goal, it doesn't mean I blew it. I can just eat everything I want. I still had an upper limit that I didn't want to go over. And then moderate meals are by definition imperfect because we're not trying to measure them accurately. And then this is the no starting over. And starting over means if I eat too much at one meal, then I can eat all I want for the rest of the day and it will just start over tomorrow. Maybe, if you're lucky, you'll start over tomorrow. If you're not lucky, it'll be weeks or months later. So no starting over means I start right away with my continued recovery. I like using that word, continued recovery. It just means I have an imperfect abstinence. Then there could be rituals around food eating. For example, you could light a candle before you eat and then blow out the candle after. That was a way of having a start and an end to a meal. Or praying before eating. Or my 1, 2, 3 before meal eating or snacking. Can one size fit all? That's the problem with OA. One size doesn't fit all. And it's to a large extent, it's disagreements about food plans are why 12-step food addiction programs have splintered into so many different groups. I wish we were all back under one umbrella of OA, because under OA you can be on your strict food plan. Nobody's going to say you can't be that strict with your food plan in OA, but unfortunately I'm not in charge, so that's that. Now at this point in the handout I'm going to give you, there are about 5 pages of detailed notes about taking step 1 from the AA Big Book, which I think are useful. But I don't have time to go into all that here. But it's in the handout I'm going to give you. So I'm going to skip those 5 pages. But like I said, if you're coming into OA, you need to work all 12 steps. So go ahead and work steps 1, 2, 3, up to 9. The rest of the talk today is going to be about steps 10, 11, and 12 is going to be what I'm going to concentrate on. Again, hopefully with that step 1, if you really take that step 1 to the core of your being, that can give you the beginning of an abstinence. And then start working the steps like your hair is on fire. In the original program, they would work all the steps in a month. They would work all 12 steps in a month. Or before the program, they only had 6 steps, but they would do it very quickly. In fact, the prospect, they would go talk to the prospect in the hospital, and they would get him to work steps 1, 2, and 3 before they even took him to a meeting to meet the other alcoholics that are recovering. So you don't have to spend a month on each step. You don't have to spend a week on each step. You can do them very rapidly, And that's what I learned from the OA Primary Purpose Program, that it can be done very rapidly, and it's useful to do it rapidly. You can always go back on the second time in the program and work the steps more thoroughly, take longer on them, because you've got the recovery. But you want to get the recovery, and that means you've got to get all the way through the 12 steps to get that recovery of the 12th step. Now, the other reason I'm going to talk about 10, 11, and 12 is that they include the other steps in that 10, 11, and 12, and I'll demonstrate that in just a minute here. So let me go on and start talking about step 10. So step 10 is continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Now, there's, I think, 5 sentences in the big book that tell you how to work step 10, and those 5 sentences are these right here. I'm not going to actually read this to you. I'm going to tear this apart into a whole bunch of different little steps here on this next slide. So here we are. It starts with continue to watch for. And, you know, in software engineering, we have this idea of a watchdog timer. It would be a task on a computer that would say sleep for 1 second, then it would wake up and it would check for some condition, and if it found that condition, it would do something. If it didn't find the condition, it would just go back to sleep and wait for another second. So wake up once a second to check for some condition. This is what I need to install into my brain. I need to install a watchdog timer up here that's going to watch for my character defects to come up. And this is the kind of the most important part of the step, because I can be oblivious about my character defects for days or weeks or months and just go on living life and living in my character defects. And until I get this part here going where I'm watching for it and trying to be aware of it, I'm not going to make any progress. The good news is that once you actually notice that you're in a character defect, that's the beginning of step 10. That's when you start working step 10. So what I'm looking for, was I selfish, dishonest, resentful, or afraid? So basically, those are the character defects that we write about in step 4. So I'm looking for one of these character defects, and I'm going to explain later that I think all of these character defects are all related to selfishness and self-centeredness. For example, dishonest. I'm dishonest because I'm trying to protect myself against something. I'm resentful about what happened to me in the past, or I'm afraid for what's going to happen to me in the future. So these are all about me. Then the next step is to say, God, please remove the defect at once. First of all, it's recognizing that I can't remove it. It's not saying I have to remove that defect at once. It's saying, God, please remove the defect at once. So that's taking step 6, realizing that God has to do it. I can't do it. It's also working step 7, when you actually ask God to please remove the defect at once. It's also working step 11, because you're making it into a prayer. God, please remove this defect at once. So this is working steps 6, 7, 11. Then I discussed this with someone immediately, and I used to think that this was an optional part of the program, an optional part of the 10th step. You know, there's some cases where I do something, and I got to go make an amends, so then I just go and make the amends. Or it's obvious I can't make an amends. There's no way to make an amends, so I don't make an amends. I thought the only time I would contact my sponsor about a 10th step was if it was in that gray zone in between there. I'm not sure if I should or I shouldn't make an amends, so then I would contact my sponsor and ask about that. But this is not an optional part of the 10th step. This is an essential part of the 10th step. This is like, if you skip this step, it's like doing the 12 steps but skipping step 5. You don't want to skip that. You don't want to skip step 5. You don't want to skip this part of step 10. And the reason it's important is because it's disclosing to my sponsor one more time, I was a jerk on the freeway. That's one of my frequent 10 steps, is I was a jerk on the freeway. You know, I was being selfish and self-centered, wanting to get where I wanted to go and not caring about other people and whatever it was, you know. So this is an important part of ego deflation, because I'm admitting one more time to my sponsor that I had this character defect that I've been working on for years and I still have it. That ego deflation is necessary. Then, if I've harmed anyone, I make amends quickly. This is working steps 8 and 9. So, and you know, it should be as quickly as you can. If you, my favorite story about working the 10th step is that one time I was going to a meeting, and this was about 10 years ago, I think. I was going to an OA meeting, and I stopped in a coffee shop. It wasn't a Starbucks, it was another brand, but I had to wait for the barista to make my coffee. And first of all, there was a line there, and didn't they know I was late for my meeting? Why don't they get rid of that line? But I put my order in, and I wait for the barista to finish my drink. And then I noticed that some people that were behind me in line got their drinks before I got mine. So I said something to the barista. I don't remember what I said or how I said it, but I could tell by the expression on his face that he was hurt by my comment. And he said something about how my shots had taken too long to pour, so they had to redo them or something like that. So when he finally put the drink out there, I grabbed it and I ran off to my meeting. And at my meeting, that's when I realized I got to do a 10-step on this. So immediately after the meeting was over, I went back to that coffee shop. And unfortunately, the barista wasn't there. I asked somebody where did the barista go, and they said he was in the back taking a break. So I said, could I talk to him for a second? And he came out, and I made my amends to him, and he was very gracious about it and thanked me for it. And here's the thing. If I had not done that 10th step, if I had not gone back and made that amends, I probably would have never gone back to that coffee shop again, because I wouldn't have wanted to run into that barista. I wouldn't have wanted to have that guilty conscience if I happened to see that barista again at that coffee shop. So I probably would have avoided it and went to a different coffee shop. But because I made my 10th step, I could go back to the coffee shop. And in fact, he and I kind of like were friends. We would have a conversation. Whenever I came into the coffee shop, he would talk to me. So it changed something that I would have avoided to something that I look forward to. And the quickest I ever made a 10th step was about a year ago. My wife and I went for a walk, walking our dog. And I was complaining to her, about her, to her. I mean, that's not the way to do this, but that's what I do. And I was complaining about her to her. I can't even remember what I was complaining about. But my watchdog timer must have gone off in my head while I was saying the sentence. And so I added at the end of the sentence, and I'm sorry. So that was the fastest 10th step I ever made. Within a second of my infraction, I said I was sorry. If you can't make the amends right away, if the person has disappeared and they're long gone, you can make the amends to someone in a similar situation in the future. For example, if I'm in the fast lane of the freeway, driving 10 miles over the limit, I'm in the fast lane, I'm going over the limit, and somebody comes up and starts tailgating me, I get pissed off at that about them tailgating me. Now, my character defect would be to slow down and make them get, even closer, or take my time pulling over, like very, very slowly moving over into the lane next door and let them go by, but make them wait a little bit longer. Those are all my character defects in action there. My immediate amends would be to, as quickly as possible, get out of their way and let them go on. And the way to make amends in the future is that when I am in the fast lane, going over the speed limit, if I notice somebody coming up behind me, pull over sooner. Let them go ahead of me. I don't have to be first in line in the freeway. That doesn't work to try to be first in line on the freeway. So you can make the amends preemptively or as quickly as you can. And then I turn my thoughts to someone to help. And this can be a 12-step call. You can contact somebody, a sponsee or a sponsor in the program to do a 12-step call. Or you can just be nice to people. Like open the door for people in the stores. And this, do this as quickly as you can too. If you just did a 10th step on the freeway, when I get to the destination, open the door, let other people go in before me. Say nice things to the clerk. Start a conversation with the clerk instead of just throwing my money down and leaving. And then love and tolerance of others is my code. And this is, the fourth step mentions tolerance a couple of times when it talks about resentments. So this is what we're trying to do, is to live in love and tolerance instead of living in selfishness and self-centeredness. So this is an important part of 10th step too. This is the Am I Selfish quiz. If I'm resentful, it's because someone did not do what I wanted them to do in the past. They did not do it my way, and that is being selfish. This is trying to show you that all of my character defects come from being selfish and self-centered. If I'm angry, it's because someone is not doing what I want them to do right now. They are not doing it my way, and that is being selfish. If I am fearful, it's because I know that someone is not going to do what I want them to do in the future. They are not going to do it my way, and that is being selfish. If I am guilty or remorseful, it's because I got my way at your expense, and that is being selfish. If I feel jealous or envious, it's because someone has something I want, and I want it now, and that is being selfish. So all my character defects come from selfishness and self-centeredness. So step 10 continues with the 10-step promises, and we have ceased fighting anyone or anything, even alcohol, and if tempted, recoil from it as a hot flame. And that's how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition. Now, you notice I say I'm a recovered compulsive overeater? People ask me, does that mean you think you're cured? And the answer is no, I don't think I'm cured. And the 10th step says that next. It says, we are not cured of alcoholism. If I was cured of alcoholism or compulsive overeating, I would no longer have the allergy of the body. That's what it would mean to be cured of alcoholism. They would be able to take one drink and not have that compulsion to keep drinking after that. They are not cured in AA. I am not cured in OA. If I have a big binge, who knows if I'm going to be able to stop after that one big binge. So I'm not cured. What we have, and this is in the 10th step too, what we have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. And that's what steps 10, 11, and 12 are doing. They're maintaining our spiritual condition. Actually, that's what I heard for a long, long time, but then somebody said, no, those are really the spiritual growth steps. This is how you grow your spiritual program, is by working 10, 11, and 12 throughout the day, every day, throughout your year. And that's how you're going to prevent the relapse. And this is how you're going to prevent falling back into the relapse once you get your abstinence back. And then 10th step prayers. How can I best serve thee? Thy will, not mine, be done. Now, the 11th step is sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contacts with God as we understood Him. There are two forms of meditation mentioned in the big book for the 11th step. There's the when we retire at night, we can constructively review our day. Were we resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid? Do we owe an apology? So this sounds like the 10th step, and some people think this is how you work the 10th step. But this is not the 10th step. This is the 11th step meditation at night. And then there's the on awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. This is the meditation in the morning that he does. And in the morning we ask God to direct our thinking. We ask God for inspiration, an intuitive thought, or a decision. See, that's my higher power. I'm asking for that intuitive thought or decision. And then we usually conclude this period of meditation with a prayer that we be shown through all the day what our next step is to be, and that we be given whatever we need to take care of such problems. So that's what shows that those two things that are mentioned at the beginning of the 11th step in the big book, he just says we conclude this meditation. So those two things were meditations. And then he goes on and talks about prayer. And the 11th step prayer is this, and the short version is, thy will be done. And then in the AA 12 and 12, they have, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. That prayer is in the AA 12 and 12. So then in step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, and that's what is the major result of the spiritual awakening, and that's what allows me to be abstinent one day at a time. So that's the spiritual awakening that we get. We tried to carry this message to compulsive overeaters. This is, again, part of not being selfish and self-centered by getting out there and trying to help other people. Because if I was if this could be a selfish and self-centered program, I wouldn't have to do this. You know, I could just live in my belfry on an island and be all spiritual awakened all by myself. But to do it, I need to actually help other compulsive overeaters and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So those are the ways to both prevent relapse and to recover from relapse. Use the tools also. Use the tools in any way you can. So now we're going on to the second part, which is ask it basket questions. So, okay, so I'm ready for questions. Well, I do consider it to be abstinent, even though I'm imperfect. If I eat too much of the meal, it doesn't mean that I'm going to, start over on day one. Because, like I said, starting over is too dangerous for me. I can't afford to do that because who knows if I'm ever actually going to get the abstinence back. So, I consider it to be part of my abstinence is that I'm imperfect in it. It's the whole program. Surrender is the whole program of recovery. It's, thinking that I'm not the be-all and end-all, that I am not the way to cure myself. I can't cure myself. It's impossible. I'm the problem. I'm not the solution. So, it's not at all about surrendering. Surrendering is surrendering this Frank that thinks he's in charge of everything, surrendering to that higher self that's within. That's the surrender that I need to do. Oh, I think that was the what would God have me be. Now, I never did that exercise. Somebody suggested that at a meeting, and that's what I wrote down, and that's what I'm sharing with you. I never did that exercise. So if you do that exercise, share it with people and tell them how it helped you. I sure hope so, because I sure hope you're not in risk of losing your abstinence, because I fall into that same category. I came from a Christian religion, so I'm familiar with it, and I have no problem with it. Most of my relatives are still the same brand of Christianity that I was raised with. And that's fine. I have no problem with it. It just doesn't work for me. And as long as you have any kind of concept of any kind of a higher power at all that's necessary here. You don't, as long as you're not thinking you yourself are the higher power. If I don't think that Frank is the higher self, then I'm okay. Okay, well, the formal 10-step practice is what is what part of the 11th step, that one at night. That's the one that most people think of as the formal 10-step practice of doing it at night. I think the most important time to do the 10th step is on the instant. In the instant that you first notice you have a character defect, that's when you got to do the 10th step. You can't wait until tonight and do it tonight. So I meant to say this during my talk here. I am a great proselytizer for the 10th step. I am a great proselytizer. I'll get out there and I'll put my proselytizing out there in front of anybody, but I am not as good at doing the 10th step as I proselytize. I wish I were as good as I proselytize. I wish I did it 5 or 6 times a day. I don't. And you know, even though I know that I have to contact my sponsor, I often don't contact my sponsor because I made the amends. I'll contact him later and then never get around to it. So, you know, I do need to work the 10th step better than I do right now, but I'm doing the best that I can, and I do it a lot faster. I was really, really happy when I had that instant 10th step where I added the "and I'm sorry" at the end of the sentence. That was a victory for me. Well, yeah, I don't know the difference between selfish and self-centered and self-seeking. You know, it's all about self is what I think the problem is. Self is the problem. It's the thinking, it's the identifying with the Frank that's talking here. If I think that's who I am, that's the problem. The Frank that's talking here is just a small part of the whole Frank. And it's that seeking after that Frank that's talking is the one that's the problem. I assume the Am I Selfish quiz there is showing that all of my character defects, because all those things were my character defects, my resentments, my fears, all those things are all character defects, and they all come from the selfish and self-centeredness. That's what I think of. And the other thing somebody reminded me is that OA is not a Christian program. It is not a Christian program. I am so grateful to one of the early members in OA in AA who got Bill to add the "as we understand him" in 2 of those steps. It's God as we understand him. It doesn't have to be the Christian God. It doesn't have to be any kind of a particular God. There's no dogma about anything about God, except that the only dogma you have to believe is that God can help you. Whatever your conception of God is, if it's good, orderly direction, any of those things are perfectly fine. They can help you with the program. That's all you need. You know, I live in my head so much. I'm a thinker, not a feeler. You know, I have a hard time getting in touch with my feelings. The main way I get in touch with my feelings is when I'm yelling at somebody. Then I figure out that, oh, I'm angry. Okay, yeah, I'm angry. That's how I get in touch with my feelings. The subtle feelings are lost on me. So all of you people that you feel your feelings all the time, more power to you. Pay attention to them, because you might be able to notice that feeling that you're having is coming from selfishness and self-centeredness. That's what you might want to notice. That if you're worried about the future, if you're in fear, oh, this COVID-19, I might catch it, whatever, it's all coming from worrying about yourself or resentments. The big thing about resentments is about what they did to me in the past. You know, I can remember people, those guys in 8th grade that called me hippo. If I run into one of them, I am still not over that resentment. I still have that resentment. So I know that's coming from my selfishness and self-centeredness. For 14 years now, I call my sponsor, basically I think it's all 14 years, I call him 3 times a week. We have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8:30 a.m. call, and I have an alarm on my clock, and I hardly ever miss it. And if I do have to miss it, I let him know ahead of time, but it's 3 times a week is how I talk to my sponsor. But I can text him anytime, any place. Yeah, in fact, I look forward to getting my 14-year abstinence my 14-year chip when we get back together and meet in person. I'd like to have somebody hand it to me. You know, again, I'm only claiming 14 years of imperfect abstinence. So, you know, if you were trying to ask me what my perfect abstinence is, then I'd say maybe it's been 3 or 4 days since I had more of a meal than I wanted. I don't know, something like that, you know. But that doesn't mean that I binged at that meal. It just meant I had more than I wanted. You know, I had my mind made up for what I was going to have, and then I had one little extra thing. Okay, so it wasn't what I originally planned when I went in, but it wasn't a big, huge binge, and it's not a big deal. Now we're going to do the writing exercise, and these are the possible writing prompts. And this is what I came up with. If you have something else you want to write about, please be my guest and write about anything you want. But you could write about what are the symptoms you notice that can show that you are on the relapse process before you take that first bite. Are you aware of some symptoms that can cause that to happen? What other ways are there to keep an abstinence between step 1 and step 12? And if you had a relapse, do you think you were really and fully taking step 1 as you binged? Or were you just telling yourself, I will start tomorrow? Does that mean you believed you had the power to start tomorrow? And do you have any other thoughts about relapse or about recovery from relapse? So that last one is a catch-all. You can write anything you want for that last one. And so you have 10 minutes to write, and then we'll come back and we'll do the breakout rooms, hopefully, if they work. After 10 minutes of writing, there were 15 minutes of small group sharing and 20 minutes of general sharing. Now I will describe the contents of the notes PDF file. First of all, here's the table of contents. Please take a look at some suggested OA relapse literature and the old out-of-print pamphlet before you take that first compulsive bite, remember. I really like that old pamphlet. I would also recommend that you read Appendix B on taking the first step using the AA Big Book and Appendix C on substance versus behavioral addictions and perfect versus imperfect abstinence. The Notes PDF file also contains the links to both the Notes file and to this video. For more information about Overeaters Anonymous, check out www.oa.org, where you can find OA literature and the local OA meetings and online Zoom meetings that you can attend.